Hello and welcome. I'm Jackie Lockie, your financial planning maestro. This series of podcasts is aimed at existing financial planning professionals as well as those looking to enter the financial planning profession. This particular series of podcasts is focusing on financial planning businesses. We share new ideas and challenge your thought processes to help you improve your service to your clients. We have some amazing guests lined up, helping you look at things very differently. I hope that you enjoy today's podcast episode. Hello and welcome. I'm Jackie Lockie, your financial planning maestro. And today we are talking all about questions, client questions, how you could ask better questions, getting a better method to ask your client questions. And we are discussing this really interesting topic with Brendan Frazier from Wired Planning in the US. Hello, Brendan.
Hey there. Thank you for having me. Excited to be here. And as I told you just a minute ago, this is something that I could talk about passionately pretty much all day, any time of the day, every day. So I'm excited about it.
Excellent. So as we were just saying, I've been stalking Brendan on social media and he has newsletters as well to sign up to that. We'll give you some details. I'll post that in the show notes as well for today's podcast. But we are going to start right at the very beginning, Brendan, and I'm going to ask you about how you got into the financial planning profession in the first place.
Yeah. So when I saw this question, I just kind of smirked like I always do because I get asked it a decent amount, and I think I should probably try to come up with some really, really cool story, right? Like some really emotional, like inspiring, maybe gut wrenching story about my path into this industry, because it's just not how it was, but I wish that it was, because it would make for a much better answer. But no, ultimately, like the only thing I can tie back to, like kind of explain as to what maybe paved my path, is that growing up, we had a family, there's a family that our family was friends with, and their kids are younger than I am. And so they were kind of like, these people were younger than my parents. So there's this guy that the dad I kind of looked up to a little bit in a way. And he worked for Merrill Lynch. So he was like your traditional stockbroker with Merrill Lynch. And so I remember thinking like, oh, you know what? That seems kind of cool, being a stockbroker, being in finance. I like him. And so I kind of thought maybe that I was interested in it, but like never really did much about it. I've always just been I've always been an athlete and thought that I wanted to play baseball for the rest of my life. And that came to a screeching halt. And so then I had to decide like what else I wanted to do with my life. So, and then ultimately, like after college, the way it worked out was the job opportunity that I had, and the person that I jived with the most was with an insurance firm here in the States. And it was the old traditional model of, hey, we're going to hire a bunch of people and hope a few of them stick. So I did that for about 6 months and got licensed and trained and everything. And I'm not going to tell all the details of the story. Long story short, my wife and I decided that I didn't want to go down that path of building a business yet. And so I transitioned and stayed in the industry, but went to this company where we were doing retirement consulting for financial advisors. So the advisors would have retirement income situations that they needed some help with or answers on. And so we had a product that was helpful in developing or generating retirement income. And so we were the experts on this one specific product. And so what that did was it gave me, basically it was my foot into the industry, my foot in the door to get in the industry, dip my toe in the water. And instead of working directly with clients and having to build a business, I was able to work sort of indirectly. So it was me and then me and then working with the advisor who was then working with the client. So it was kind of it was almost like an easier way to break in and get some experience in the industry, because you're not like taking people's livelihoods into your hands and trying to build something from scratch, but I was still getting to experience the industry, experience what it was like to see what it was like to work with clients. And maybe the best thing that happened from it was I was able to, I've worked with and talked to thousands of advisors over the course of my career in that role. And you get to really learn quickly and pick up on like what what works well, what doesn't, the things that you think, the things that you want somebody to do with your money, the things that you wouldn't want to do with your money. So it's a good crash course on what works and what doesn't. And so all that being said, I stumbled into the industry because it was the best job opportunity I thought that I had coming out of college. Nothing inspiring in that. And then ended up finding a job at this company, again, where we're doing consulting with advisors, and it just happened to be a good company with a cool culture. And the rest is kind of history from there. And fortunately, I have a passion for the industry and the profession. And just like you, trying to help it, continue to grow and improve and enhance over time.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, I think, Brendan, you're not alone. I think many of the over 45s, they're probably all going to be shouting at their podcast app right now. But most of us, certainly of a slightly older generation, shall we say, not the oldest, but most of us fell into financial planning. I know people who have degrees in geology, who were going, on oil exploration, oil rigs and things like that, when the bottom dropped out of the oil market, and so kind of gave up and were looking for different professions as well. So I think it takes all sorts of different skills of different people to come into financial planning professions. So you're definitely not alone switching from sports to financial planning. So yeah. Excellent. Yeah. So, and during that time at that retirement planning firm when you were helping advisors and clients, is that what sparked your interest in, the approach with client meetings and the kind of quality of the questions? Maybe the advisors were asking particular quality of questions and you were thinking, well, actually, I could ask a better question than that.
Well, the worst thing you can do is, I guess the quote that I like a lot that I heard recently too is that the easiest job to do is the one that you don't have, because you can play armchair quarterback and sit back and evaluate and you can really critique and pick apart. So I tried to never really do that. But it was that job though, that it didn't necessarily open or I shouldn't say it's what directed me all the way to creating a more emotionally engaging client experience by asking great questions. What it did, though, was that came later. What it did was it opened my eyes to the fact that despite the fact that we're dealing with numbers and helping people align numbers and talking about investments and finances, that there is this whole other element to the equation that nobody really ever talked about or dealt with, which was the psychology and the emotions and the human aspect of working with money. And you talk to anybody that's been in the business long enough, and the story's always the same. It's like, I got into it because I liked the numbers side and I like doing the numbers in the investment piece, but I eventually realized that there's more to it than that. And so what this job did, again, when I'm going around talking to several advisors a day, every day, and you start picking up on these things that people are saying. So I would hear things all the time, like, Brendan, sometimes I think I'm more of a therapist than I am a financial advisor. Or, Brendan, I feel like I maybe would have been better off with a degree in psychology rather than a degree in finance or economics or whatever it was. And so you start hearing that over and over again. And then, so I just decided to start asking probably the next natural, logical question once I started hearing that more often, and just decided to ask in return and say, I hear you say that. I hear a lot of people say that, but I'm curious, what do you do about that? If this is so important, if at times you're more of a therapist and you're hearing about people's dreams, their fears, their emotions, if at times you feel like you need a degree in psychology because the clients that you're working with aren't actually doing what they're supposed to do, and it's not a numbers problem, it's a behavior problem. What are you doing to get better at that aspect of working with clients? Because the money side's only half the equation. And inevitably, it's always just a resounding, nothing particular, nothing necessary. Maybe I've read a few books, or I've tried to read a few books or this or that, but nobody was and there were no trainings, courses, or designations that taught you how to deal with emotionally charged human beings on the emotionally charged topic of money. I shouldn't say that there's none. There are some. It's just most people weren't doing it. Meanwhile, if we wanted to learn more about how to build an asset allocated portfolio, if we want to learn more about financial planning, tax strategies, retirement planning, you can go to all the trainings, courses, and get as many designations as you want on that. But there's this gap. People were saying, hey, this is what I feel like I need. And then you ask what they were doing to fulfill the need, and they weren't doing anything. And so it's just kind of this eye-opening moment of, you know what? I feel like there's a need for this. I think people would be interested, but still, you never know. No. And so that's kind of where my experience in that role opened my eyes to the human side. And then as I started diving more so into the human side, I was kind of like most people were. Initially, I kind of started off with this like, oh, it's about behavior management when it comes to investing, how to keep people invested during a market downturn. Like, what are the things we can do to do that, which is still a big piece of it. But then the more you start delving into it, the more you start realizing there's all these other dynamics that go into the human aspect.
Yeah. And I guess, certainly for me, when I was practicing, there was this nervousness whilst you were very aware that perhaps you weren't delving that deeply into, the emotional side of asking clients their questions. But then there's that danger zone, isn't there, where you're not a trained counsellor. So there's that apprehension about what the clients might say in return.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And completely normal, completely understandable. I hear it a lot, right? Like even sometimes that you'll hear people say, like, I don't really know, like, am I going to go too far? Am I going to ask too much? Am I going to be too invasive? Is this what people actually want to talk about? Like, they're coming to talk to a financial advisor, a financial planner. Like, are these things going to catch them off guard? But I think what we need to know, and I think it's important to point this out, is first of all, that's completely normal and completely understandable. If we go back to like some of the things that we know from research, talking to investors and clients, we know that 82% of clients, 82% of people say that the number one most important quality that they want and look for in an advisor are their interpersonal communication skills. Yeah. So there's a bunch of other ones. 82% say interpersonal communication skills, and that's the ability to feel heard and understood, the ability to develop rapport, show empathy, those sorts of things. So we know that at the end of the day, that's something that's valuable to clients. The other thing that we know that I find interesting is this is actually a study that was released in the last couple months. And it basically, to keep it simple, instead of getting into all the boring data piece of it, what it showed was there's a direct correlation that exists between the quality, the data gathering experience, the qualitative data gathering experience, not quantitative, qualitative data gathering experience. So asking about things that are important in people's lives, asking about their fears, their hopes, their dreams, and then that tying directly to higher levels of trust, connection, and client retention. So it's not just that we think that these things are actually important. It's that the facts show, like, hey, the better you are at having conversations with people, not about quantitative stuff, which is certainly important, you have to do that too, but about the qualitative stuff, about what it is that they want to do with their money, what's most important in their lives, what like their most valuable relationships. The more you can dive into those things, the better, the more trust you create. Yeah. The more trust you create, the more prospects that convert into clients, the more clients you also keep for a long time, because you're having a conversation with them that basically nobody else is having.
Yeah. And you connect with them on a different level, don't you?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah. And so you have developed 4 pillars to think about when asking great questions of your clients, haven't you? And I want to delve a little bit deeper into each of these 4 areas that I know that you love chattering about, which is great. And let's look at the first one. So the first thing that I saw when I kind of came across you on Twitter, I think it was some months ago now, was a list of questions. And one of them was saying, a great question minus listening is no longer a great question. And I often feel that advisors, they're under pressure to ask their clients particular questions, obviously, as you already alluded to, much about the facts and figures of stuff. And then you kind of get this cursory set of questions about, when do you want to retire? Oh, that's interesting. 55? Oh, okay, yeah, that's great. But there's more to it than that, isn't there? And there's so much more to it about being present in the room, mentally present with the client as well, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I firmly believe this, that a great question, you can ask a great question, but if it's not if you don't follow that up with listening with curiosity and empathy, like it's truly no longer a great question. And so what we know about, and I think it's important to like think about like, okay, what is listening for a minute, and like, why is that important? So first of all, if nothing else, you can know this, that when they do brain scans and show people talking about themselves, what it shows is that when somebody talks about themselves, it lights up the same areas of the brain as eating chocolate and sexual activity. Now, if you don't like eating chocolate or sexual activity, know that the vast majority of people really like both of those things. And so if you can get somebody talking about themselves, which means you have to listen, you can get somebody talking about themselves, it lights up those same area of the brain. So that's first and foremost, which I think it's important to know. It's a rewarding thing. And I challenge people with this all the time. It's like, think back to the last conversation you had with somebody where you thought to yourself, I really like that person. I really enjoyed that person. Or man, I feel like I could talk to them all day, or time really flew by in that conversation. Odds are, if you felt that way, you probably talked more than the other person did. And that's why you felt that way, because your brain's on this path of lighting up the areas of the brain that's like the reward center. So there's a reason that you felt that way. Moira Summers she wrote a great book called Advice That Sticks, that it should almost be like required reading for us, for the profession, I think. She says that the research shows that the number one predictor of client satisfaction in a first meeting, it's not how great they feel about your process. It's not how many years of experience you have. It's the amount of airtime that they get in the first meeting, which again requires being able to listen, to be able to sit back and ask good questions, to listen and let them talk about themselves. So what we always say is, if you want to think about it like kind of practically, or how do we do this? Like the best thing you can do is try to strive for an 80-20 listen to talk ratio. So 80% of the time listening, 20% of the time talking, because it's really hard to do. So inevitably what'll happen is, if you aim for that, if that's kind of your goal, you'll probably end up at a 60-40, 70-30. Well, hopefully at least 60-40, hopefully more like 70-30. And if you land there, that's a pretty good spot. That's a pretty good place to land. So aim for 80-20. You'll probably fall a little bit short, but at least gives you something to kind of think about and think through. And then two more things I would add on listening, because this, obviously, you can tell this is something I'm passionate about. One is most people tend to think, or there's articles, books, knowledge out there that says like listening is just simply sitting there, nodding your head, kind of like maybe using some reassuring words like, yeah, okay, right, like that kind. And that's all important non-verbal type communication to show that you're listening, but good listening is not just a passive endeavor. So my favorite way I've heard this explained is, a good listener is less like a sponge and more like a trampoline, where you give somebody the space to bounce their thoughts, their feelings, and their ideas off of, and you actually amplify and energize their thinking by listening. So you're not a sponge. You don't just sit back and let somebody talk and nod your head and give the right, and try to mirror their body language. You're actually a presence that bounces, that they feel energized and amplified by. So you're more of a trampoline than a sponge.
That's fantastic. That's a fantastic analogy. I love that one. I remember years back I did a Dale Carnegie course, and that was really interesting, trying to do that, to listen and support other people. And it changed the way that I asked my questions and my clients after that. So that was really interesting. But you said that there were 2 points that you wanted to make. There was another one in there somewhere, Brendan.
Yeah. So the last one is just because I'm so fascinated by this idea on the podcast. Every guest that comes on, I ask every one of them at the end who the best listener is in their life and what makes that person such a great listener, just to try to start, amassing and accumulating some responses to get a feel for how can we define what makes good listening, what creates a good listener.
Yeah.
And by far and away, the number one common thread in all the responses is the idea of being present. And that sounds really simple, right? Like, oh yeah, of course that's the case. But being truly present is really, really hard to do. I mean, it means like you shouldn't have your phone out. It needs to be on do not disturb, needs to be in a drawer in another room, but like truly being there and being present and making that person feel like they're the only thing that matters at that point in time is the key to making somebody feel heard and understood. Again, it's one of those things that sounds simple. It's just really, really hard to do.
Yes. I remember that I had a client, I think I've talked about this on a podcast actually. George Kent and I were talking about this the other day. Had a client, two clients who were GPs, and they came to see me many years ago for their annual review, and they weren't looking at each other. They felt clearly uncomfortable in each other's company. So, but I said to them, everything okay? And they nodded and carried on. So we were talking about their retirement planning strategy, and I asked them where they wanted to be in 5 years' time with it. And they looked at me, they looked at each other, and they looked back at me, and they said, divorced.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And I was like, eek. I was in my early 20s at the time, and, that it could have gone one or two ways, because I could have gone, right, that's really interesting. I'll write that down and, move swiftly on.
Right.
Which I think, I had this urge to do, because as a, early 20s, a year old, I didn't feel armed or prepared to be able to cope with an answer like that. But actually what I did was I thanked them that actually they felt that we'd created a safe environment that they could have that discussion about what they actually wanted, even if it was to part company with each other. But it's a valuable lesson that when you ask these questions, you don't know what you're going to get back in response, and then how you cope with that, especially in a first client meeting. Because we traditionally spend such a lot of time talking about, well, this is our service and this is what we can do for you. This is what we've done for other people in your situation, rather than asking about them, don't we? Yeah, probably the biggest mistake that most people make, most advisors make, is try to make that especially like a discovery meeting, first meeting, more about, there's this assumption that, they probably want to know a little bit about me and my background and the services that we provide and all the things that we can do and all the things that we've done for other people just like them. But the thing you have to remember is that people don't buy the plane ticket. They buy the destination. They don't buy your process. They buy the result and the outcome. And what they're looking for isn't to be like wowed and impressed because you have some great service model and some great customized portfolio process. Those are all means to the end. Those are all parts. Those all come with what they're going to get. What they don't really care about that. What they want to know is, there's two things going through every client's or potential client or client's mind in a first meeting. And it's, do I like you and trust you? That's the same one. And do I feel the certainty that you can provide the result or the outcome that I want, or that you can solve the problem that I have, depending on, whichever it is. Some people come in because they've got a problem that they need resolved. But so there's literally their brains sitting there. They don't know this, but their brains sitting there going, do I like and trust you? And do I feel certain that you can deliver the outcome and the result that I want? And at no point do they think, at no point will your perfect customized research description of your process provide either one of those things. Yes. And that leads me really nicely on to talk about what happens in a client meeting and the order and structure. And what order and structure do you recommend when you're looking at, the kind of questions that you're asking clients, and where are advisors going wrong with all of that?
Okay, so I've got to throw you a curveball here, because in the last few months, I've actually added 2 more principles to the list. And so and the reason I'm saying it now is because I think the one that you mentioned first, that a great question minus listening curiosity is no longer a great question. I think that still comes first, but there's 2 that we've got to squeeze in here in the middle before we get to the order and structure, if that's okay.
Far away. Yeah.
Okay. So, and this came from experience, just from working with advisors and kind of hearing what they would have similar issues with, hey, I don't really know how to go about having these conversations. I don't know how to approach it. Is this what people want to talk about? So the one thing that first and foremost that you have to know is that I'm going to call it your way of being or how you are. So, and I'll explain in a second, but your way of being when you ask a question is just as important as the question that you ask, or the way that you present yourself, the way that you come across is just as important as the words that come out of your mouth. So what that means is you could have two people asking the same great question. And if one person asks it with excitement and energy, enthusiasm, they're going to get a completely different answer than the person that asks it and feels a little bit awkward about asking it, or they're unsure about whether they should ask it, or they don't really believe that they don't really fully believe that it's a great question. So what we've learned from communication experts is that your tone of voice is one mechanism among many that can actually create and elicit emotion in people.
Like the vibe, isn't it?
It's like the vibe. That's exactly right.
The vibe you give off. Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So if you think about, like, sometimes there's situations where in your life with a spouse, with a child, whatever it might be, there's situations where somebody's if they're amped up and they're feeling a lot of emotion, you want to use more of a calm, soothing, low voice, talk a little bit slower that brings them down. At the same time, using more of a positive, playful, excited tone, it actually creates it elicits a more positive response, which gets somebody more in a collaborative frame of mind, which is going to get them to open up and answer the question differently. So when you're thinking through working with clients, what I always say is, if there's a question that you ask or want to ask that you don't feel excited about hearing the answer, or you don't think that it's truly a necessary question to help unlock the life that they want to live, and you're not excited to hear the answer, you probably shouldn't ask it, because you're not going to get a good answer. And so the other funny thing is, whenever I ask people what their favorite question to ask clients, whatever their favorite question is to ask clients, almost inevitably their favorite question is the one that gets the best responses. And so then you go, okay, well, it's probably the one that gets the best responses because you're going to get a good response, so you're more excited to ask it. And so it creates this cycle, right? Of like, well, no wonder it's such a good question. So that's first and foremost. Or actually, I'll say this. So there's a advisor that I've talked to and worked with who, like, it doesn't have to be playful or excited. You can come up with your own term for how you want to envision this. But for her, she sees herself as being zestful. And so she's kind of created this question mantra when she's working with clients, where she wants to bring a zestful tone to the conversation and the questions that she's asking. And so just know that your way of being, the way you approach the question, absolutely determines the quality of the answer that you're going to get.
Yeah, that's interesting. And does that roll out into, how you're dressed? And, because I think, before the pandemic, many financial planners would go around in suits and ties and things like that, seeing clients. And I think most people don't anymore. They might have, blazer or jacket, and probably open neck collar shirt or something like that. But I guess that's as part of your being, of what you're comfortable with. And if you're comfortable in your own skin wearing what you're wearing, then I guess that helps give you the confidence to ask those questions. Yeah.
I mean, so I'm not an expert in all things like that's what I call the invisible influences, right? Of like what's being signaled by the way that you're dressing, what's being signaled by the background in your office, the setup of your office. And actually had Rory Sutherland on, who's a legend, well, basically worldwide, but especially over there. And he talks a lot about that, which is interesting. But I think to your point, what I would say is, whatever you feel, it's about how you come off, how you present yourself, your way of being. So if you feel more like yourself when you're dressed in a blazer than you do just a full on suit and tie, then that's gonna show itself in your conversation. If you feel more comfortable in the suit and tie, then that's gonna show itself in the conversation. So I mean, you probably don't want to go in with, if you're meeting with somebody that comes from a white collar background and you're sitting there with a t-shirt with holes in it, like that's probably a little bit risky. But maybe use a little bit of what's the word I'm looking for? A little bit of common sense. That wasn't a tough word, by the way. I'm not sure I struggled with that one so long, but I think you're right. I think it's how you feel and what you're wearing is going to come across in the questions that you ask, the way you present yourself, the conversation that you have. So well, if you have more questions on that, let me know, or I can, because I know we didn't budget time for 6 principles. So you can ask more questions about that, or I can tell you the next one.
Let's you said there was 2 extras. So the first one being your way of being, and the second one is
establishing a context before asking a question. So if there's a question where you feel like you're not really sure how somebody's going to respond, you're not sure if that's something that they want to talk about. So for example, you had George Kinder on, so he has his famous 3 questions. And so if you think about the first one, where you're essentially asking somebody that, if money was no issue in your life, you're financially secure, what would your life look like? And then the second one is, hey, a doctor's told you that you only have either like 5 or 10 years left to live. I know, talking to advisors, like there's a little bit of a hesitancy around, do people want to answer these questions? Like, they're coming for financial advice. Do they really want to talk about what's going to happen, what they want to do if they're going to pass away in a few years? And so the best thing you can do if you feel that way, or if you don't, is establish context before asking the question. So if somebody was to come in and one of the first things you were to say is, hey, what if you're financially secure for the rest of your life? What would that look like? What would you be doing? How would you be spending your time? So on and so forth. That might catch somebody a little bit off guard if they're not expecting it, right? So, but if on the flip side, you were to say, hey, thank you so much for being here, Mr. and Mrs. Client. One of the things that we truly believe as a firm, that basically it's involved in everything that we do, is that money is simply a tool to fund the life that you want to live. We think that if that's not what it's for, what's the point? We want to align your money with your values and your life so you can live the best life possible. By the way, very few people will ever say that they don't think that's a good idea, right? That they don't buy into that philosophy. If they do, it's just a good natural filter for whether they should be a client or not. If they don't believe in that and you do, they probably shouldn't be a client. But if you start off by saying, hey, this is what we believe. We believe money is a tool to fund the life that you want to live. What that means is we need to get really clear on what that life looks like, so we can now align your money and your finances with that life. And we've got a few questions that we want to ask to help uncover that, to do that. Is that okay with you? And then nobody's going to say no. And so now you've established why you're asking this seemingly off the wall question, so that when you ask, hey, let's assume money were no issue, you're financially secure, all your finances are taken care of, what would your life look like? There's no doubt in their mind why you're asking. There's no hesitancy around, I wasn't expecting that. Now they know why they're answering the question.
Yeah, that's fascinating, isn't it? And it really kind of, it's logical if you think about it, isn't it? Just positioning the question in the right context. So you're not kind of dropping a ton of bricks on somebody, they walk in through the door and you go, oh, let's talk about the meaning of life, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Yes. That's
you're kind of there are warm up questions, if you like, to kind of the big, deep and meaningful questions. So I think that's a really great way to think about it. And so, going back to our structure then, is there a particular structure that we should be thinking about when we're asking these questions? You've kind of earned the right to ask the questions by, your kind of warm-up questions, if you like. And, in your experience, is that where advisors tend to go wrong? Is that they think about these, kind of big, juicy questions, and then they're unsure about the context to put them in. And so then they don't ask the questions and just kind of, pussyfoot around the point.
Yeah, I think that, and I think it goes back to what you said earlier too, which is not knowing what type of answers to expect by asking the question. And then when you don't know, when you fear the answers that you're going to get, then you don't really know what to do with them, how to handle it, both in the conversation. You don't know how to handle it in the conversation, but at the same time, you don't know what to do with it after the conversation, right? So even a question as simple as, what's important about money to you? And then inevitably, like oftentimes you'll hear things like, oh, it's important because I want to have freedom. I want to be able to leave the 9 to 5. I want to be able to do what I want when I want. It's like, like, those are good. That's like a good answer to get. But then if you're not used to it, if you don't know what to expect, you don't know what to do with it, it becomes a little bit intimidating. And I think that's a big piece of it is getting, and we talk a lot about getting to the point where you've had enough and you've heard enough of these conversations where it starts to, like, you have enough reps to where it basically it starts triggering, where you hear words, you hear phrases, you hear things that you know are, they're emotional phrases, they're emotional things that people say, and you know to go down that path, and then you know what to do with it when you get it. And it just comes from practicing experience. But back to your point, the order and the structure matter because it creates flow. And so there was this research study done where they had two people, or they had groups of people sit down for a conversation. They were on a blind date, and it's like, to boil it down and make it simple, one of the groups was they sat down with another person. They just asked a bunch of questions, tried to get to know them. The other one was given a specific order and structure in which to ask the questions that started off a little bit like, basically they escalated in terms of intensity. And so at the results of that study were that the blind dates where there was an intentional order and structure felt higher levels of connection, trust, and likability. And so I think that speaks to the part about, if you were to go in firing on all cylinders and say, somebody sits down, you're like, so tell me about your goals. What are your financial goals? Well, first of all, that's a whole nother topic because nobody actually thinks about their financial goals, whether you like, for the most part. Yes. But what you want to do is you want to create this rhythm and this flow where somebody gets comfortable. They get in this rhythm of talking, they're opening up, and then they're starting to tell you things where you're sitting there going, I'm not even really sure how this is relevant or how we got here, but here we are, because now they're just rattling things off left and right. Yeah. And so you did it at the beginning of this conversation. We do it at the beginning of the podcast that we do as well. And it's intentional. You want to ask somebody, especially in the beginning, you want to ask questions that people are familiar with answering and that elicit some type of positive or emotion in general, but generally positive emotion. And that's, if it's easy to answer and it comes with an emotional answer, that opens the floodgates, right? Yeah. So asking somebody what's something that's easy to talk about. Well, ask somebody about their past and positive experiences from their past, and they could probably go for days, right? Yeah. You asked me how I got in the industry, right? How did you get here? What was your path? Well, I gave you the short version, and then I was fighting the urge to tell you every detail of how I got there along the way, because it's something that I've thought about. It's something that I've answered before, and it's something that I have a positive emotion to, right? And so now you've got the wheels turning. You've greased the wheels a little bit. I'm in a conversational flow. And so I'm now to the point where I'm comfortable talking. And so when you ask more meaningful questions, you sort of earn the right to ask those questions. And I'm now in a place where I'm primed to open up and answer them with more detail.
Yeah. Yeah. And talking of the quality of those questions, certainly here in the UK, I'm sure probably in the US, if you've ever been on any kind of course that deals with questions, there's always been a red mark over asking closed questions. And I know one of these pillars, or there's 6 pillars now rather than 4, is about not stressing over asking closed questions, isn't it?
Yeah. And so that's one that always gets people's attention, right? It's like, don't stress about closed-ended questions. And everybody goes, huh? What? No. I've been told my whole life that I'm supposed to ask open-ended questions. So first of all, clarification. Yes, open-ended questions are inevitably, unquestionably, undeniably, without fail, better than closed-ended questions. So what I'm not doing is I'm not arguing and making the case that you should ask all closed-ended questions. But for anybody that's heard that about not asking closed-ended questions, but asking open-ended questions, you also are probably familiar with the feeling of sitting there talking to somebody, asking a question, and then going, oh, shoot. No. That was close. I asked a yes or no question. What's a better way to phrase it so that I can ask it open-ended? Or you go, oh, that was closed-ended. I need an open-ended question next. What should I ask? And so there's this unnecessary pressure around asking open-ended questions because you're supposed to. And guess what's happening as you're stressing out about these not asking open-ended questions? You're not listening to what the person's saying. Yeah. And so we just said a great question minus listening and curiosity is no longer a great question. So you ask a question, then you're all stressed out about how you asked it and how you could ask it better. And you're losing the listening piece. You're losing the connection. So So what do we do about that? Right? Okay. How do I actually not stress about it, but still ask open-ended questions? Well, you go into conversations just like you did with this conversation, just like I do with all the podcast conversations, is you go in with a loose framework of open-ended questions that you know that you want to ask and will ask. And as long as you've got some good open-ended questions lined up and prepared that you've picked and you have in your process because you know it's going to elicit good conversation and the type of responses that you want, well, guess what? Then you don't have to worry about closed-ended questions anymore, right? Because then you're asking these good questions that you know you're going to ask, you know why you're asking them. They're going to facilitate good conversation. And so closed-ended questions are something you just don't have to stress about at that point.
And the final pillar that you talk about is that the most powerful question is the follow-up one, isn't it? But one of the things that worries me about follow-up questions, and I've actually seen this happen in client meetings, and other financial planners have quietly confessed to me that you end up going down a rabbit hole sometimes when you particularly with couples, one party responds to a question and you go, oh, that's really interesting. You ask your supplementary question and then you end up just talking to that one client instead of the two of them that are in the meeting. So there is that danger, isn't there, with those follow-up questions? There's still great questions to be asking, but you've still got to be, I don't know, a kind of self-aware of where you're going with that one person, particularly if you've got more than one person that you're talking to.
Yeah. So I think that point about going down a rabbit hole, especially with one person, I think that speaks to more so like controlling the conversation than it does like the question side of things. That speaks to being aware of involving both people and both spouses and making sure to tie or the partner, whoever it is, but making sure to tie the other person back in. The other thing I would say is and I get it, like you don't want to go down aimless rabbit holes. No doubt. Like you don't want to go down these. You only have a certain amount of time. You only have a certain amount of, really people only have a certain amount of mental capacity to sit there and have these emotional conversations. So you don't want to waste time. What I would say though, is that most people, generally speaking, don't have trouble going down rabbit holes. So if you find yourself in that place where you're like, hey, you know what? I keep having these conversations that are going 30 minutes longer than they're supposed to, and we're talking about things that don't matter. That's actually a good problem to have because you can always dial it back in. You would rather have that problem than the problem of not being able to get somebody to open up and talk at all. In fact, if you're not having any rabbit hole conversations or you're not having to prevent rabbit hole conversations, I would argue that you probably need to be better at asking follow-up questions. And so I say that the follow-up question is the most powerful question you can ask, because here's what happens. When you ask somebody a follow-up question, it immediately signals to that person that it's about them and not you, and that you're really, really interested in what they have to say. Okay. So think about, you ask somebody a question. It could be anything. It could be like your question at the beginning where you asked me about how I got into the industry. Even we're on a podcast, so it's a little bit different. Like I'm supposed to talk, but in a normal conversation, if somebody were to ask you that question, or they were to ask, hey, what'd you do this weekend, or whatever it might be, our minds, we're answering the question, but your mind, you don't want to monopolize the conversation. You don't want to be the person that talks too much. You don't want to talk to somebody if they're not interested. And so your mind's always wondering, it's scanning, going, am I saying too much? Are they still interested? Should I keep going? What do they want me to say? or should I just stop now? And so if somebody asks you a follow-up question about what you've just said, it gives your mind permission to keep going and to open up. So follow-up questions are really what trigger somebody opening up and talking more, because you've given them permission. You've signaled to them that you do want to know more, and they can feel comfortable uncovering more information, revealing more information.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, there's so much more that as financial planners and, people who support financial planners can do to help open up those kind of conversations, and, to know where the line is, where, you're comfortable in yourself going up to with a client, so you don't need to be, have a degree in psychology or whatever it might be, trained counsellor or so forth. But you can still go down those rabbit holes, and you can still pull the conversation back. But it needs that structure, doesn't it? And it needs to be thought through. It's not just a case of having, slapping any old question down on the agenda. You've got to think through that flow that you were talking about right at the start of this conversation to help the client feel comfortable and to help them feel engaged and, energized to answer your questions.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And can I mention maybe just like an overarching point about questions in general?
Yeah.
Okay. So, and again, this goes back to another study. And this is kind of whenever you asked earlier about what got me into this. And so one of the things that really made me passionate about this whole human side is that the research, the knowledge, the answers to the human side of working with people. A lot of it's already out there. It's just in different realms of the world. It's in behavioral economics. It's in psychology. It's in communication. We just haven't figured out a way to bridge it and apply it to financial services and working with clients and their money, right? So it's like, that was a big impetus or a big passion of mine, was saying, hey, I don't want to know knowledge. I want to know, practically speaking, how to use this and work with clients. And so I say that to say there's another study out there. Again, it comes from another realm. It's from the Harvard Business Review, where they sat people, they were looking at questions and the power of questions. So they sat two groups of people down, and in group A, they had two people, and group A was required to ask, or they were told they could ask no more than 4 questions of the other person over the course of 15 minutes. In group B, there were two people, they had 15 minutes. They were told they had to ask at least 9 questions of the other person over the course of 15 minutes. So on two different groups, one group, it's kind of like, hey, you can't ask many questions. The other one's focused on asking questions and asking good questions. And so they go back, they scrutinize and analyze all these conversations. They talk to the people that were getting asked questions, or the subjects in the experiment. And what they found was that asking questions, the group that had to ask at least 9 questions, the people on the receiving end of that reported higher levels of trust and higher levels of likability with the person that they were sitting with than the other group. Okay. So if we go back to what we said earlier, and we said, all right, the most important meeting you'll ever have with a client or prospective client, or I guess at this point it's a prospective client, is the first meeting, your discovery meeting, because they want to know, do I like you, and do I trust you, and do I feel certain that you're the person that can deliver the outcome that I'm looking for and the outcome that I want. And so what we know is that questions and asking great questions is a superpower for building trust and likability. So the better you can get at asking good questions and listening with curiosity, you're constantly establishing trust and building a connection and establishing likability. And oh, by the way, right? I don't think anybody would argue that in order to do your best work as a financial planner and navigating somebody's life and their finances, you need to know as much about that person and their finances as possible. And so how do you find out as much as you can? And how do you get them to open up and talk to you about these things that they don't talk to probably anybody else in their life about? Well, you have to ask great questions, because that builds trust and connection. And then when you ask the right questions that elicit the right that elicit the information that you need and the emotions that you need, that's how you uncover the information so that you can do your best financial planning work. So I always joke and say it like this: like, if I were to go to somebody and say, hey, I have a pill And in this pill, it'll absolutely transform your first meeting with clients and prospects, because it'll instantly create trust and likability, and it'll get them to tell you everything that you need to know about their life and how to do financial planning right for them. Is that something that you want? Well, nobody says no to that, right? It's like, yeah, of course I would. No. It's like, okay, great. It's pretty simple. Again, it sounds simple, but it's actually hard to do. But all you have to do is ask great questions and listen with curiosity. And it's a superpower for doing that.
Yeah. And I love that analogy, having a superpower. And so for the financial planners and paraplanners in the UK who want to develop their questioning skills, what would be your tips of things, that any immediate steps that they could take now?
Yeah, right. So this is one of those things where it's like, hey, is there anything we can do? Like, what's the best way to do this? The good news is there are ways to do it. The bad news, if you want to call it bad, well, maybe we shouldn't call it bad. Maybe we should call it the flip side of that, is that it's like anything. It doesn't just come naturally. It takes a little bit of work. It takes some honing and some perfecting. And the good news is whenever that's the case, it means that most people aren't doing it and aren't willing to do it. So it's an easy way to give yourself a competitive advantage over everybody else. So the first thing you should do is try to think through about probably 3 to 5 questions, I'd say, just to keep it simple at first, that you like asking, that you're excited about asking, that you want to ask clients, because when you're excited, that comes out in the way you're asking, it's going to get back better information. So even having like the loose, like we said earlier, a loose structure and a framework for the questions that you want to ask is probably the best place to start. So we have an article on the website where I went out and polled a bunch of advisors around the world and got them to submit what they consider to be their favorite questions to ask clients in a first meeting, and basically compiled all those answers into an article. And so it's essentially a question menu where you can, if you want some ideas of good questions to start jogging your creative conscious, you can go there. There's a list there, and you can even pick 3 to 5 just from that list. It's basically whittled down to the best and the most popular questions that people ask. So I would start there. And then the second thing, really the only way to do it from there, is to practice and learn and start hearing what some of the answers and responses sound like. Learn how to get better at like picking up on triggers and following up with good questions. And so I wouldn't do that right away with a prospective client. The best way to practice is either with somebody in your life. Could be a spouse, could be a family member. That's probably a good starting point. But ultimately, you want to try to find somebody that's like a good friend, but not a great friend, where you've got to it's kind of like a prospect coming in where you may not know them super well, but you kind of know them. You want to get to know them better. You can do it with friends like that. And then if not with friends, then start with your clients that, and everybody will know, either your clients where there's less at stake, or your clients where you can't screw up no matter what, or where they're with you for life. And so you're going to kind of test it out on them. You need a little bit of a testing ground to get better at it. Do that 3, 4, 5 times. You'll start seeing and getting comfortable with the answers and how to handle them. And then you can take it into an actual meeting with a prospective client.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Find a good friend, but not a great friend.
Yeah, right. That. Yeah. Like we all know, everybody literally just thought of like a few people where they're like, oh yeah, that's somebody that like I'm kind of friends with, but I really don't know a lot about. And this would be a good way for me to try to practice getting to know them better.
And I guess depending on how big your office is, you could probably practice on each other, because I guess we might fall into that category too. Yeah, that's
a good point too. Yeah, that's a great point. Like I know people that they practice with their colleagues, and there's no bad way to practice. It's just whatever is easiest, whatever your preferred way is. Getting practice in is the best. It's really the only way to do it.
Yeah. Well, Brendan, we are out of time. We've been nattering for ages. So I just wanted to say it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for joining me today. And I love that analogy of that money is just there to fund the life that you want to live. And the developing my superpower are certainly the 2 biggest messages that I'm going to take away from today. Definitely everybody out there needs to work on their superpower of questioning skills. Thank you so much for joining me. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah, thanks a ton for having me. And just wanted to say I appreciate the work that you're doing, say thank you for the work that you're doing to raise the level of advice over there in the UK. It's always good to see.
I hope you enjoyed today's podcast. It's really interesting, isn't it, to listen to other people's points of view about different things, all relating to our wonderful financial planning profession. If you know anyone who might be interested in listening to any of these podcasts, please pass on our details to them. So that's it from me. Join me again next time when we'll be talking all things certified financial planner related, and also dropping in on our new entrants to the financial planning profession. Bye for now.